Great. Welcome, everyone, to our 1636 Forum Fireside Chat with FIRE, appropriately named, and Harvard Alumni for Free Speech tonight. I'm Allison, and I'm a co-founder of 1636 Forum, a Harvard alum. I want to thank all the attendees for being here to Connor and Sean and John for joining us tonight. So I'm going to quickly run through their backgrounds so that everyone can know who we're talking to tonight. And then we're going to dive right into the FIRE results for Harvard this year. So first we have Sean Stevens from FIRE. Sean got his PhD in social psych from Rutgers, and he from 2013 to 2016 worked at Rutgers while also serving as the first research director of the Social Perception Lab, and then as a postdoctoral fellow. He was also in affiliation with the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And in 2016, Sean became Heterodox Academy's first director of research, where he developed Heterodox's campus expression survey. And now he is chief research advisor at FIRE. He really Sean's research has focused primarily on how moral convictions produce motivated reasoning within the political domain and how this motivated reasoning can distort research in the social sciences. And more recently, he's begun investigating the psychological factors that motivate support for censorship and self-censorship, which we'll get into tonight. He's also a member of the Best Practices in Science movement and works to promote scientific integrity practices in the social sciences. So thank you, Sean. Connor is the campus advocacy chief of staff at FIRE, where he oversees the day-to-day operations and strategic execution of FIRE's higher education work. He previously led FIRE's engagement and mobilization and alumni outreach efforts, and before joining FIRE, he served as the director of communications for the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Connor has spoken and taught on campuses across the country related to free expression. I'm sure some people here have seen him on other webinars about free expression on campus. And he holds a master's in political communication from American University and a bachelor's degree in history from Ashland University. We also have John Evangelakos joining us from Harvard Alumni for Free Speech. John is president of Harvard Alumni for Free Speech, an independent, nonpartisan group of Harvard alumni dedicated to promoting free speech, academic freedom, and viewpoint diversity through the Harvard Radcliffe community. He's also an alum himself of Harvard, of course, and NYU Law, and is currently of counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us tonight. We're really excited to dig into the FIRE results. We at 1636 sent out our analysis of Harvard's placement in this year's FIRE rankings and got, huge response back from people across the Harvard community. And so we're really excited to have this conversation. I'm going to quickly go through just a summary of how Harvard fared this year. And then obviously we'll have FIRE, who put together these rankings, talk a bit more about the results. So just for those of you who haven't had a chance to read our summary yet, in this year's FIRE College Free Speech Rankings, which focuses on polling Harvard undergraduates, the university has basically shown, I'd say, fragile progress. So Harvard was in last place for 2 years in a row. This year it climbed to 245th out of 257 schools. So it's an improvement, but still close to the bottom. And that rebound really reflects a mix of small wins and persistent challenges. So on the positive side, Harvard earned a high honors bonus for President Alan Garber's strong defense of free speech when the federal government this spring pressured the university. And Harvard has since then, as we've been covering at 1636, responded in terms of lawsuits and in other ways to that threat of free speech. Students also report lower levels of self-censorship than in prior years, which suggests, I think, at least on paper, that some progress is being made, but I'm sure there will be some debate among this group about that. But one of the things we noticed when we were looking at the results was that they also reveal some pretty deep contradictions. So in principle, Harvard students say that controversial speakers should be allowed on campus. But in practice, 4 out of 5 of them also say it's acceptable to then shout these speakers down. More than half of all students say it's okay to block entry of others into these speakers' events. Students also really have had their trust in administrators eroded. Only 8% of students at Harvard believe that the university would defend a controversial speaker. It was 27% 4 years ago, so that's a pretty big drop. And Sean, I'd love to hear what you think about that. And then when it comes to difficult conversations, out of all the topics that FIRE really polls on, Israel-Palestine stands apart. So 73% of Harvard undergraduates say they can't discuss this topic openly, and that's far higher than the percentage that say they can't discuss other issues openly. And those issues include topics like affirmative action or racial inequality. Then another part of the FIRE rankings that's important are campus policies. And Harvard currently holds what FIRE calls a yellow light policy rating. Basically, Harvard has 10 rules that FIRE has flagged as too restrictive of speech. And FIRE estimates that if Harvard were to revise those in certain ways, it could, to green light standards, Harvard's ranking could dramatically rise from 245 to about 84. So while Harvard isn't dead last anymore, and progress is possible without a broader cultural shift towards more trust and open dialogue, we think these gains seem like they're going to remain pretty fragile. So now, before we dive into methodology, which I think a lot of people have asked us about, I want to just start with a bigger picture question for FIRE. So you guys have been in the news a lot lately. There was this New York Times profile that was very popular and shared around recently that basically highlighted that FIRE defends both conservative and progressive students and faculty, and that FIRE filed a brief in support of Harvard in its federal funding lawsuit against the government, which we also support. Can you quickly explain? I know there's one rule that you guys have talked about in prior webinars I've been on with you about FIRE's approach to free speech advocacy.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Sean, I'll take this one. It's kind of simple. If the speech is protected by the Constitution, we'll defend it, period. We have never and we won't ever comment on the content of the speech. Our like little asterisk is if someone's calling for censorship or a lack of, free speech protections, we'll say, sure, you can do that, and we'll defend the right to do it. But we're a true single issue organization, so we're going to tell that person they're wrong. But other than that, you could probably pick your political topic of choice, and we've defended speech on both sides of that issue.
Thank you. That's super helpful for the audience. And so let's just dig a bit more into FIRE methodology, especially since we're lucky to have Sean here. So can you briefly just walk us through FIRE's methodology and survey process and what the rankings tell us or don't tell us about a university's speech climate?
Yeah, so we partner with College Pulse, which is a survey outlet like YouGov or Pew Research Center or the National Opinion Research Center at UChicago, where they have panels of undergraduates on campuses across the country. In our experience in working with them and other places, their process of validating that these are living, breathing college students at the universities they say they are at is very rigorous, which is obviously important to us if we're saying that the responses are coming from specific campuses. So we've been working with them for the past 6 years. They, yeah, like a YouGov, it's an opt-in panel, but this year we got over 400 students at Harvard, which I think is a very good sample, given the undergraduate population. The rankings themselves are a mix of the student responses to the survey. It's a 20-question survey. There's different subcomponents within that we can get into, as some of these have already mentioned, like self-censorship, tolerance for different speakers, acceptability of different forms of protest, things like that. And then we combine that with our policy reforms team's evaluation of schools' speech policies. Schools with a green light rating get a bonus, schools with a yellow light rating and a red light rating lose points. And then we at FIRE also maintain 3 different databases that track the outcomes of speech controversies on campus. We have our deplatforming database that looks at mainly invited speakers, but it could also be play performances, art exhibits, comedy shows, movie screenings, anything like that that's kind of organized by a student organization is bringing in some kind of outside speaker, or it's an art exhibit sponsored by the school for the students. If these things are deplatformed, they would go in this database. We have Scholars Under FIRE database that we say Scholars largely tracks attempts to sanction faculty for their protected speech. But we use the word scholars because it could also include postdoctoral researchers, PhD students, research fellows. It's basically you have to have an affiliation with the university and you're living the life of an academic. So like you're teaching, you're researching, or you're doing both. And then we have an equivalent database for students and student groups called Students Under FIRE. Schools can earn we don't think that schools are not going to have controversy, even if they have all of the good speech policies that we'd like them to adopt. Like we don't think that, and especially a school like Harvard, we expect them to have controversy because it's a prominent institution that's going to invite a lot of people, and pretty much no one's going to turn down an invitation to come speak at Harvard, versus some other school that might be harder to get to and isn't as prominent. People might turn that down. So we're aware that schools like Harvard, Columbia, et cetera, are probably facing more controversy. But that also gives them, we think we've provided, it gives them the opportunity to do well. Because they can earn you can earn bonuses for doing well in the rankings, for handling these controversies well. Penalties do occur if speech is censored in some way. So to clarify, if students are protesting a speaker or calling for a faculty member to be fired, there's no penalty assigned to the school for that, because that's freedom of speech. Like students are free to, as Connor pointed out, it's like they're free to like say things that we're not necessarily happy with. But it is protected. So like we'll point out like, hey, you're wrong. You're kind of wrong in doing this, but yeah, you're allowed to say it. You'll only incur a penalty if speech is kind of infringed in some way. But is that like the potential to earn bonuses and kind of set the right example at a place like Harvard, I think is very important, and leave it at that. But that's broadly the methodology. We could get into kind of the nitty-gritty of it, but we only have so much time. So
Yeah, I think two audience questions I want to just make sure we answer relating to that. So it sounds like having certain policies or the wording of certain policies can impact a university's score, and maybe something like institutional neutrality, for example. But whether or not a university actually abides by its own institutional neutrality policy, is that part of the calculus right now? And if not, do you have plans to change that for the future?
So it would, if they don't, it would show up in different ways. So a number of schools have adopted institutional neutrality since October 7th, 2023. But if they then basically like say, oh, well, we can't have this speaker here because XYZ, which might not be an institutionally neutral position, it would show up as like a penalty in the database that way. It could also show up in student survey responses if they kind of see that. Like we've seen definitely at schools like Columbia and Barnard, maybe getting a little ahead of who's at the bottom in the rankings and getting a little off of the topic here, but the students are very upset with the administration there at both of those campuses, with how they've handled protests and controversies on campus since October 7th.
Fire's also a
We would
little,
presume it shows up in the data. Go ahead, Connor.
yeah, sorry, Sean. Fire's a little
Yeah.
picky with how we give out that institutional neutrality star. There's other orgs, Heterodox, ACTA, real good orgs. I believe, I know ACTA does, I believe Heterodox, they'll, say a school adopted institutional neutrality if a college president, for instance, at like Williams, I believe President Maud said, I'm not going to say anything, but there's no binding resolution from the top down at the school that trickles down through departments. So our list is much smaller, and we're kind of sticklers for the schools that get on that one. So we're, uh, I guess, cautious on the front end as well as looking forward on the back end.
That's really helpful. And one other quick question that came in from the audience. Earlier this week, Harvard Kennedy School professor Tarek Masood hosted Harvard Law School professor emeritus Alan Dershowitz as part of his Middle East Dialogue series. This has been really hailed by Harvard as a series that shows constructive dialogue and difficult conversations, where Professor Masood invites speakers who might have divisive opinions on the Middle East and really engages with them in front of students and then with open Q&A. So actually, FIRE co-founder Harvey Silverglate was in the front row and got a shout out during this event. Do FIRE scores positively take into account these kinds of constructive dialogue focused events happening on campus, or sort of incentivize having the most difficult of conversations rather than not at all?
Currently, we don't. I think we would consider certainly factoring them in. I think our concern would be not that we would not be aware of all these events on all the different campuses we survey, or the potential, like that type of thing is maybe what we'd be concerned about. So currently, no, but we have seen, and I think there's reason to consider incorporating things like this at schools that have programs doing this, because we've seen a lot of improvement at places like Vanderbilt, Dartmouth, et cetera, that have instituted dialogue programs. And not just improvement, like, because they then have also, like, they've done that in tandem with speech policies, but we've seen improvement in their survey scores on things like, oh, students feel more comfortable talking about these topics, or they self-censor less. So there's a reason to consider introducing additional bonuses for something like that. Yeah.
Got it. Let's talk now about Harvard's improvements this year because it did improve in the rankings. So rates of students saying they were self-censoring declined. So in rankings for self-censorship, Harvard jumped from 185th place to 88th place on how often students self-censor during conversations with professors, in class discussions, with peers, or on social media. But still, 47% of students say they have self-censored on campus at least once or twice a month. So would love to talk about that in a bit. Students are showing improved comfort on discussing uncomfortable topics. These are some of the topics I mentioned earlier. So Harvard moved from 123rd to 63rd in quote unquote openness, as you guys call it, based on student responses on how hard it is to have an open and honest conversation about a controversial topic like abortion, affirmative action, or gun control. And I'll just note here that while most questions received 10 to 20% saying the conversation about the topic was difficult, like I mentioned before, 73% of students thought it's difficult when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And then political tolerance among Harvard students actually improved slightly this year from 71st last year to 64th place this year. In theory, these students are saying they would let controversial speakers on topics like abortion should be completely legal or the Catholic Church is a pedophilic institution speak on campus, though I think we'll circle back to the stat in a bit. And then Harvard received fewer penalties for deplatforming events, attempts, and student and faculty sanction cases, and then the high honors bonus for President Garber's April 2025 letter refusing unconstitutional federal demands. So when you look at these larger gains, Connor, for example, like this large jump of self-censorship from 185th to 88th place, what explains them, and are these gains statistically significant, one might say?
Yeah, I'm not a data scientist, so Sean, correct me if I'm wrong. And anything I say here, if I even mention the word statistical significance, did you say cautiously optimistic or fragile, whatever term you used at the start, Allison? I think it is something good to look at. Often we'll see university leadership, whether it's presidents, academic departments, boards, institute policy change, start communicating different values, and then the student perception is a lagging indicator. I think Harvard is slightly different because it is so upfront on the national stage that, every time there is a clash, whether it's between the government and Harvard or even just in a individual school on campus, it makes headlines and students see it. So this survey was in the field, I believe, from January to June or so. So we're a little ways into, President Garber's real tenure. He was interim president for a little while, if I'm remembering correctly, and now he's in it, right? But he's out front, kind of leading the charge. Fire is the first in line to criticize Harvard, and turns out we're the first in line to defend them too when they're, in the right. And the one category you didn't mention is one I actually really want to point to, the administrative support score. So students' belief in the administration's willingness to go to bat for, controversial
We talked
speech or
about it earlier, but yeah.
yeah. Well, it jumped up three spots, right? From 250 to 247. But that's the first time since we've been doing the rankings that there's been any improvement there. And, I could point to things like, institutional restraint or something I really like that I don't think gets enough credit, the adoption of the Chatham House rule, right? Creating a environment in the classroom where students are not afraid to question because they're not going to go get ridiculed after the fact. Now they may, but it's kind of instilling virtues, for lack of a better term, in the culture. So I wish I could jump, 12 months into the future and have this conversation again, because I think we'll be able to say much more firmly whether or not this stays. But, we have also seen colleges really slip when faced with controversy. Would I bet on Garber to stand firm? More so now than maybe a year ago, which is awesome to say, but I don't want to predict that far out just yet.
Well, so John, from your vantage point, how has President Garber and the university's leadership done, and do you expect it to pay off in the years to come?
So there's been a lot happening over the last year or so, and there've been a lot of movement, a lot of changes, adoption of institutional neutrality. Connor noted the Chatham House rules for discussions. There's been a series of reforms adopted to promote civil discourse. There's now an intellectual vitality program directed towards sort of the younger students to try to get model and promote open discourse. I guess this is still early stages, and we're not seeing the results play out yet. So I think what this shows, Harvard needs to stay the course, and there's a need for continued, enduring structural reform. And again, we should be encouraging and cautiously optimistic, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I'd be curious to see, how they score next year's survey.
Well, okay, let's talk about the work to be done. So in terms of where Harvard really continued to fall short in the rankings and had lack of improvement this year, comfort expressing ideas among students slid backwards from 235th place to 247th. So when asked how comfortable students feel expressing opinions in class with peers in campus spaces or online, a majority of students report discomfort in every scenario. And I'll just know that Harvard also has done its own set of surveys. Some of them have been published publicly that also indicate very widespread discomfort in these settings. Trust in administrators, as we've mentioned, is low, with only 8% of students believing Harvard's administration would defend the rights of a controversial speaker. And disruptive conduct has been somewhat normalized. In at least rare cases, 79% of students say shouting down a speaker is acceptable. 58% say it's acceptable to block entry into a talk. And maybe most disturbingly, 32% of students believe political violence is acceptable to stop a campus speech in at least rare cases. And so I think I'd love to hear from Fire about how you see this observation that we've highlighted a few times, where Harvard students say they're open to controversial speakers coming to campus in theory, but then are very open to or interested in disrupting these speakers, shouting them down, or even potentially using violence to stop their speech. How do you interpret this paradox of tolerance, Connor or Sean?
Yeah, I'll start, and maybe Connor wants to jump in at some point. But the pattern of results there that you see at Harvard are actually, it's not unique to Harvard. It's pretty common across most of the elite universities in the rankings. Like that pattern shows up with pretty much all the other Ivies, most of the top private universities that aren't Ivy League schools, and most of the top state R1 institutions. I think there's a couple things at play here. Some of it's the wording of the questions, but I do think some of it is these are like our most elite institutions, so part of the culture that is still present and inculcated to a degree is the tolerance. Like allowing the person I disagree. Yes, on a base level in the abstract, I would allow the person I disagree with to speak. So I think that's what you're seeing showing up in the tolerance questions and those metrics, is that those schools still do a good job of conveying those values and then having students that embody those values. The questions that ask about protest, like shouting down, blocking entry, using violence. It's like to be very clear about it, because it's certainly the violence what has been in the news a lot lately, but we're asking students if it's okay that other students do these things, so not them. Most of students are saying these things are rarely acceptable. I still think that's concerning. I still think that signals evidence of well, like what's rarely compared to net. Like, to me, the only appropriate answer is never, and so like what falls in that rarely category. I doubt if we had polled them and asked, I doubt many of them would have said assassination falls in that category. I think they probably have something different in mind. But so I think like while they're related, they're kind of getting at different things and put the students in different mindsets when they're answering them. I do think the percentages of students that say rarely on all these questions is concerning, but I would note, like, Harvard's kind of right around where the national average is on that. There's other schools that are considerably higher on that violence question of students saying rarely acceptable, and that's not good. Connor, I don't know if you want to add anything, but
A little bit. I'll kind of hypothesize on why there's a difference. I think I'm in agreement, and the best part about fire is sometimes we're not always in agreement about the reasonings, but we come at it anyway. So I think I agree with Sean on the tolerance half. The rarely supportive shoutdowns or violence. I always ask why. I always try to figure out how to get at it, and I'm starting to believe more and more that there's just kind of a lack of understanding of boundaries for protected expression. You hear all the time that a heckler's veto is okay, right? I can go up and use my free speech to drown out someone else's free speech. You hear that argument on campus, but that in actuality, that's not okay, right? So if we're not educating our students in, how to exercise their rights properly, I'm not surprised to see these numbers slip. When Fire makes recommendations, we have a 10 common sense reforms for higher ed, document that I probably link to more often than anything else. And the top three things are figure out what you're about, right? Have a clear mission, right? You're a knowledge generating institution. Your motto is Veritas. What do you need to get at that? Then get your policies in order. Are they, restrictive of speech? Do you have kind of vague and arbitrarily applicable policies that students are going to have to tiptoe around? Or are they speech protective? And then educate on the why of those policies, right? Students can't read a 50-page document freshman year and understand. A professor friend of mine at University of Virginia asked the general counsel's office for a document of their speech policies, gets this like 75-page thing, said a student's never going to read this. Can you condense it for students? And she got a list of things that students would get in trouble for doing, not guidelines on how to use their rights properly. So she went and said, great, we're going to make a for students by students. Here's how you exercise your rights in a constitutional manner. And that's great, right? Finding ways to inject that into the student experience early on and show them how to engage in the classroom, in the quad, at the cafeteria, I think would go really far. And I know, maybe John or Allison, you could talk a bit about this. I know it's really tough at Harvard with all the different schools and colleges to kind of have that uniform orientation or early education into these things. And I know different schools at Harvard are doing it differently, but I would love to know what works at Harvard and what doesn't.
John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Well, universities are famously decentralized organizations, and Harvard is maybe famously the most decentralized of them all. So what's your thought on that?
No, well, for sure. I think that's one of the strengths and one of the weaknesses of Harvard. And look, we saw it last year with some of the protests over the Israeli in Gaza situation, where we had essentially people doing the same thing, the same misconduct, were treated very differently depending on which school they were attending, because discipline was decentralized in that respect. I think the university now is taking steps to centralize that, to make sure that similarly situated people are treated equally. And there has to be a balance, and we have to recognize, the university has to recognize that in certain kinds of conduct require a university-wide response. That falls on President Garber and the senior staff, and that falls frankly on the corporation board. And they need to start taking that into account.
We've seen students at universities respond really well to kind of immediate and clear clampdowns isn't the right word, but immediate and clear responses from university leadership. I think it was University of South Carolina. They skyrocketed in the rankings after about 2 years of work. But one of the things that stood out to me is after they redid their policies, after they came out with a new free expression commitment, I think it was the Turning Point USA chapter wanted to have a roast of Kamala Harris, and this was the first test. And they said, no, look at all this work we did. This is what we're here for and why. You may not like it, but this is allowed to happen on our college campus. Yeah. And I almost expected to see a drop in students' appreciation for the university in a lot of these categories, but they kept going up.
Yeah, they on that roast was going to be hosted by Milo Yiannopoulos and Gavin McInnes, and it went off without a hitch. But it was also, there's a lot of pressure both from on-campus forces, students, and faculty to cancel it, and then off-campus forces, local, state level politicians, the NAACP. And they stood firm and explained literally why they weren't going to cancel the event. I'll note that the impetus to drive that improvement came from a change in leadership with a new chancellor coming in. And so I think that's, I think President Garber has had a very difficult first year, but has I think done a pretty good job.
It's been a chance to kind of redefine, Harvard. I think you're right. He has done a good job. When was the last time we gave Harvard points for how they've responded to a free speech controversy? I can't praise it enough.
And it wasn't just the one that Allison's noted. There was like one or two others too, where I mean, on one it might have mitigated damage, so it becomes a net zero, but those are important. Like those
Well,
are
you're saying really ultimately clarity and consistency people respond positively to. So
Shocker, right, John?
I think that's a good point. So on that, we have mentioned now a few times tonight the statistic that only 8% of Harvard undergrads think administrators would defend a controversial speaker, and only 20% think it's clear that Harvard's administration protects free speech. So Sean and Connor, what would it take for trust to recover, and how has FIRE seen other schools rebound on those statistics?
So I do think when like so Connor mentioned South Carolina and you say it in some of their data, like they do this effort to reform the policies. They're making these statements. The survey response, there's a lag. There's a little bit of a lag. But we have seen it start showing up in schools that have made these efforts. I think earning trust back can be difficult. Um, Probably a change in leadership helps in earning trust back, most likely. But I think, I actually expect to see improvement in that for Harvard next year because I really do think I don't think students at like Columbia necessarily are happy with how their administration handled
yeah.
the the stripping of funding, and I think students at Harvard will look more positively on theirs.
Allison, do you mind if I just ask Sean a question?
Yeah,
And the answer
sure.
is probably going to doesn't he probably doesn't know because it's an anonymous survey. But can you actually track when you do the survey? Does it say whether you're a senior or a sophomore or freshman?
They
And are there
give, yeah,
different?
we have their estimated graduation year, right? So obviously things can change, but accordingly, yes, we have like effectively when they anticipate to graduate. So from that, you can extrapolate where they are in their progress.
We should say real quick, if I can make a plug, Allison, rankings.thefire.org. You can download all of this data. You can see all of our methodology. We don't hide
And we
anything.
also we
It's as
also have
transparent
a
as you could ask for.
yeah, we also have a cumulative we have a singular data file that has all the data from all the years. Very happy to share it. We're not trying to hide anything. We want people to actually explore the data and use it
As
in
the
all these different ways.
to follow up on John's question, I know Harvard was in the process of, I don't know if they actually have yet added that question to the application on the viewpoint diversity or diversity of opinions. Now I'm sitting here, hypothesizing, but I would love to look at breaks in, potential grad year based on students who had to answer that going in and who didn't.
So for
That's
context for everyone, Harvard College added a required admissions essay question starting last cycle, which is essentially tell me about a time you strongly disagreed with someone about an idea or issue. How did you communicate or engage with the person? And what did you learn from the experience?
and we could do that. We could look at that in the data because we'll have, anticipated graduation years, so you can infer when they began their enrollment. And we could look at that. We haven't looked at that, but that's something we could do.
What happens when Sean and I get on a call? I start saying, can we do this? Can we do that?
Well, I think to that question, I listened to your national webinar about some of the national level results of the rankings recently, and I think you teased this idea of potentially doing law school surveys. So can you talk about like Harvard has so many professional graduate schools. And in fact, when you look at the deplatformings and disruptions, a lot of them happen at the graduate schools. Can you talk about how you're thinking about that angle and how that contributes to a free speech climate on campus?
Yeah, so we actually do have a law school law faculty survey, essentially almost ready to, the survey is ready to go. We're just making sure we have a way faculty are more difficult to survey than most other people. They're a little fickle. Typically the way you survey them for like a peer-reviewed study is like someone basically mines all the emails from the university website, and you build like a massive Rolodex, and then you hope for a lot of them to respond. But so we're kind of updating our file with the law school faculty emails, but we should be launching that by the end of the year. It's something we're interested in. I mean, so this was brought up like earlier in the intro or whatever, and so one thing is that the one thing that the rankings do not encompass or cover that I would like them to, and I'm pretty sure Connor does too, is we're only surveying the students. And we're surveying undergrads, and so they're certainly very important to the campus culture, but they cycle out every 4 or 5 years. There's a lot of turnover in them each year. Faculty stay at a university, some of them for 30, 40 years, and probably maybe have a little bit more influence over what the climate might be like. So we have surveyed faculty in the past. We've surveyed faculty on specific campuses in the past, but that's not currently incorporated in the rankings, and that would be something we'd like love to do.
And how did you guys pick law schools first to do this?
We're trying to do all the accredited law schools, so it's a pretty ambitious project, actually. And so building that list of emails took a while with some of our other researchers and interns to do that. But we're basically going to try to survey the faculty at all the accredited law schools in the country.
What was the purpose for going law schools first instead of shooting for faculty?
Well, we've done other faculty surveys. So we've already done some faculty surveys where we've surveyed faculty nationwide, and then more recently we've surveyed the faculty on the first 55 schools that we ranked in 2020. The law angle comes from FIRE's history as a legal organization. That's probably interesting to a lot of people that are, interested and affiliated and donate to FIRE. So the law school focus maybe comes from there.
And just for context for people on the call, Harvard actually has surveyed its own faculty across all schools, both ones who teach at the college as well as the graduate schools, and found that 51% of faculty are uncomfortable leading class discussions on controversial topics. 68% of faculty avoid discussing controversial issues outside of the classroom, such as around students, peer faculty, or staff, and 41% of faculty feel uneasy researching controversial subjects. So it's certainly interesting and valuable data.
I can add to like our own faculty data. We have, like I mentioned, we have some specific from Harvard, and I don't remember it off the top of my head right now. But in general, what we find with the faculty data is they report a better climate than students, which I think makes sense. They have more power on campus, right? They have more prestige and power. But at the end of the day, they still don't report a very good climate necessarily. So they look better. What they say is that it looks better than the students say, but it's still, there's a lot of room for improvement.
Well, on that note, John, I'm curious your take. So I think Harvard Alumni for Free Speech may have been one of the ones that sent out this op-ed last year by a Harvard professor, the Harvard professor who runs the Middle East Dialogues, Tarek Massoud, who wrote this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, where he essentially argued that people often say students are the problem and the barrier to dialogue across differences on campus, but faculty he actually thinks are the problem. And he cited a lot of his own experience running Middle East dialogues where students were essentially very excited to hear from people they might disagree with, but faculty were more hesitant to even have an event like that go on, for example. And he cited Harvard itself tried to distance themselves at the time from the event. Now Harvard is hailing it as, a good way to do constructive dialogue. But John, how do you think about the dynamic of students, faculty, or even we haven't really talked that much about staff in all of this?
Well, look, I think this self-censorship concern about how it's going to affect your career, how it's going to affect your social life, how it may affect your family, I think is all pervasive. I think, I take Sean's point. Faculty are in a different position in life. They have more power, but in a sense, they're also more vulnerable. So when in any environment, and this is there's a situation. There's social media, which thankfully there was not around when I went to school, and how you say something that maybe you didn't think about, or maybe you said it the wrong way, and all of a sudden it can go viral or taken out of context. That's very dangerous. That's very concerning. You also have an environment, and we haven't discussed this at all. It's not, and I think it's touched on in the FIRE survey, but there are anonymous bias reporting systems, right? So you say something that, again, maybe you thought you didn't think about it or it was just sort of off the cuff, and all of a sudden you have somebody who's lodged an anonymous complaint, and you have to go before some disciplinary procedure. So it's a star chamber of a sort. And I think that's just very troubling to people, and they're going to self-censor, and they're going to be really, really careful. And I mean, I'm not advocating that people should sort of go off and just say whatever pops into their mind, but a university should be a laboratory and a place where people can feel free to explore their thoughts, exchange views and change their views.
And it's challenging because it's not a consistent fear. I think you hit the nail on the head. For faculty, I'm a little sympathetic because it's their livelihood, right? They build their lives around this profession. For students, it's social standing, which I understand at a certain age is devastating to lose. But Sean, correct me if I'm wrong. For a while, the students were running more towards fear of, social, loss of social standing than they were running away from fear of administrative punishment in their self-censorship. And, I look at the faculty side and it's tough. I was in grad school years ago and I had faculty, professors of mine saying, think about what you put in your proposal for a PhD program, consider what you want to research before you have tenure. And this was me who was like a half-hearted, I don't know what I want to do with my life. So I was looking at a PhD program. So if I was like half-hearted getting that advice, how bad is it elsewhere? Is a question I just have to ask. And I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, but it's definitely something to consider. I love the dialogue across differences programs that you're talking about at Harvard. Dartmouth has had a great one, Vanderbilt. And they're popping up all over at American. Lara Schwartz, I think she's actually a Harvard Law grad. She does Disagree with Professor, where she has professors go and talk about an issue they're not an expert in and get questions from students just to kind of humanize the Q&A process in a room where no one knows what they're talking about. And I think more of those, the better. Especially because you're right, you said it before. Students are curious. They want to hear different things. They just aren't often provided an opportunity where they can freely engage without that slight nagging, fear at their back.
I think that the
Yeah,
dialogue programs are important. I mean, this is certainly correlational. This isn't a causal data point. But we saw at Vanderbilt, they introduced their dialogue program 2 years ago. And the survey data last year on the question Allison's brought up a few times about students identifying the topics that are difficult to discuss. We saw a significant improvement there on every single topic, with the exception of Israel-Palestine, which I think makes sense given the climate. But then this year, story's a little more muted. We didn't see improvement again on every topic. We maybe only saw it on like 6 to 8, but one of those topics that did improve significantly now was Israel-Palestine. And again, this is correlational, but it's suggestive that this is at least somewhat effective or helpful.
Well, let's talk about some other things that might be effective, because I'd love to talk about some of FIRE's recommended changes for Harvard. So my understanding is the first is around revising restrictive policies. Harvard holds this yellow light rating from FIRE because some of these policies FIRE considers to be too restrictive of expression. And these include some of Harvard's harassment and bullying definitions that go beyond the legal standard and risk sweeping in protected speech. Prior approval rules for distributing flyers or holding outdoor events, even completely unpolitical events like Primal Scream. A vague quote unquote civility requirement in Harvard's IT use policies, an anonymous bias incident reporting system without a clear definition of bias, like what John mentioned. And if what I previously noted was my understanding is if FIRE revised these to meet if Harvard revised these to meet FIRE's green light standard, which is not necessarily to say completely delete them, but maybe alter some of the wording, its rank could jump from 245th to about 84th. The second category would be around adopting the Chicago Statement for free speech. So Harvard hasn't formally endorsed this widely regarded free speech statement that came out of the University of Chicago and is considered the gold standard of free speech commitments, even though Harvard has adopted what it is calling institutional voice, a form of institutional neutrality. And then the third and fourth categories would be training students on expressive rights, which I know FIRE recommends this training be built into first year orientation. So students right from the beginning can learn the difference between protected expression and unprotected conduct. And the fourth would be defending speech during controversies. So as I mentioned, these are some of the changes that you have said that could help Harvard rise. Can you just talk us through the specific changes to these that Harvard would need to make to reach green light status? And we don't have to really look at every single word, but like, how do we think about these policies and the way they are and the shifts that need to happen?
So you're putting us both on the spot here, but that's okay. So Harvard has a number of yellow light policies, and anyone who wants, we're happy to. I know I've shared it with you, Allison. I've shared it with dozens of people at Harvard who've asked. We have a red line memo on the various policies for changes, because you're right. We are not looking here to completely scrub the slate clean. We understand Harvard is a private institution and has, needs it needs to take care of, and we're happy to work within that sandbox. But certain things, if you look at, the harassment standards, it doesn't measure up to Davis, which is a Supreme Court standard where harassment has to be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it effectively denies the individual, equal access to education. I'm, quickly trying to mouse click with my left hand to make sure I'm not lying to you. But if you look at the Harvard language, it says harassment is unwelcome and offensive conduct that is based on an individual or group's protected status, which kind of gets it. But you see, it's a bit broader, and you go down, and it's the thing that my non-lawyer brain always looks for, that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive, and that's just a little too arbitrary. We like firmer things. Civility standards are always a tough one. I usually will get a lot of flack for this, but I like to point to Hillsdale College. We don't survey them, we don't rank them. They're a private institution up in Michigan. They don't take federal funding, so they're not, subject to Title VI Homeland, all those normal federal standards, and they don't actually promise, free speech, academic freedom up front like we'd like to see. They have this civility standard because in their mind, they don't think, a classroom discussion can truly, reach the true and the beautiful, or however they frame it, without, an equal understanding of how to civilly engage. And because that is a slightly arbitrary line, the whole civil dialogue standard, we actually label them as a warning school. So we don't rate them. We don't give them a yellow, red, green light. We say, that's fine. You're a private institution. You can have this civility standard, but you're kind of off our radar, for lack of a better term. So that is step one. I could go through a few more, but you're talking to.
I'm curious. I want to push you on that a bit and
Sure.
ask John his thoughts on this. A lot of these, I've seen the red line memo. You're asking for some pretty, in some ways, small changes, a word change here and there. And John, I'm curious if you think that the changes in wording matter more, or how policies are enforced on campus matter more.
So it's interesting because I am a lawyer. And of course, the written word is important. But at the end of the day, I think what in my mind, what's more important is how people, what is the culture? How are these rules interpreted? How are they applied? How are they understood? And I mentioned this to Connor previously, but the Soviets had a great constitution, all kinds of terrific rights. It went. I mean, the pages.
North Korea too. North Korea also apparently.
North Korea, great. Thank you, Sean. Great constitution. So I'm not saying those aren't important, but just to give you sort of one concrete example, and I haven't seen the red line, at least if I have, I've forgotten it at this point. I love the Chicago free statement on free speech. Right? It's well written, it's clear, it's short, it's to the point. Harvard has an old policy. It's I think it's from the 60s. It's not quite so clear, but I think when you read through it, I think it gets you to the same place. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't gone into that level of depth on the survey. I don't know if that's one of the 10 policies that are yellow light policies or not. But that's just an example. I think I would resist making this into a check the box exercise and really kind of look at what are the serious implications of these things. And it wouldn't matter if the students at Harvard said yes, 100% or 90%, the university is going to defend our rights to speak. They're going to defend controversial speakers. We understand what the lines are. They'll be applied consistently. I think these policies would matter a lot less. Now, a red light policy is a bad thing, right? But once you start getting past, past the red light, I still, I think I want to think about it a lot more, and I'd like to learn more about it.
John, we're both gonna owe each other some adult beverages after this because I'm gonna drive to wherever you are and keep debating you. I'm partially with you, which makes this really difficult because I agree. The culture, the actual execution on policies, the viewpoint neutral and consistent manner things are adjudicated, the principle first messaging based in mission is huge, right? That's going to carry so much more weight, and it's why I always fudge this number a little bit, so I'm going to stare at Sean and see if he says yes or no. About 60% or so, give or take, of the rankings, as a whole, come from the student experience, that student survey component. And then the administrative behavior probably equates to another 20%, give or
Yeah,
take.
it's difficult to pinpoint because the controversies, they don't happen at the same frequency at all schools. So it's difficult to like pinpoint an exact amount, but the survey responses are the majority of the
So
school.
in my non-statistician hypothetical here, you have your policies, Chicago and institutional neutrality, maybe taking up about 10%. And I would argue that on campuses like Harvard, Columbia, Barnard, honestly, most of the schools included in the college free speech rankings, firming up your foundation allows for a ton of quicker and more substantive growth than just trying to oh, this bad thing happened. We're going to address it good in the moment, right? There's an opportunity in diving into your own policies and reconsidering things. We like the Chicago statement because it's probably the gold standard. But if you look at our language, it's sort of substantially similar free expression statement because we know every college is a little different. But we think going through this process, addressing policies so you don't accidentally stumble, you don't have an administrator somewhere go a bit too far, arbitrarily apply policy. But also when you're doing it, some of the schools that do it best communicate the why to their students at the same time. And those are the schools like the University of South Carolina, where you see it click with the students and they say, oh, I get it. And then when the university is put to the test, they reinforce it. And those are lasting lessons that I think are really going to have an impact. So I'm with you that it shouldn't be 90% of the rankings, but I think that foundation matters. And this is a way universities can show without relying on a controversy that they are putting their best foot forward.
I think it's effectively it's like doing the bare minimum,
Yes.
right? If all these schools, if we go into this hypothetical world where all these schools have green light ratings and they've all adopted these perfect policies, like we'd still be looking at roughly C plus average, and then a handful of schools that do better in the rankings. So like others, it's like, yeah, everybody would improve, but it's effectively this is kind of the bare minimum. Controversies are going to happen. It's when the rubber hits the road. Like now that these are on the books, it's here, but you have to actually follow them. And that varies, I think, at different schools. There's a couple green light schools that don't do very well. I mean, kind of to this point.
Georgetown, great example. They've been a Chicago statement school for ages, and they've been a thorn in my side for even longer.
And UCLA is a green light school as well, and they've had a number of issues over the past few years with like controversies and things like that. And they're not like down at the like in the bottom 10, bottom 15, but they're in like the bottom 50, I think, roughly something like that. So the policies aren't the be all end all. Like we kind of see those as this is the bare minimum you can do for your students and faculty. And then when the rubber hits the road, we'll see what happens.
And just so everyone knows, if you're interested in looking into Harvard's yellow light policies, FIRE has these online, and we also covered them pretty in depth in our 1636 forum analysis of this year's Harvard rankings for FIRE. But now that we've been talking so much about policies, like beyond policy, culture is a lot harder to change. And have you seen examples of where a university took policy reforms and translated them into a genuine cultural shift? And what did that actually take?
Sean, I've been rambling so much about the University of South Carolina. I'm sure you have something else. If not, I'll keep.
That's one, but we've kind of covered that one. I would highlight actually your maybe Ivy League neighbor slightly to the north, Dartmouth. New president came in a few years ago, so similar situation. Like Harvard has a new president, and so has the opportunity maybe to do something similar. But she came in a few years ago, and instituted policy reform, started this dialogue program. She was just recently at the Heterodox Academy conference and really pushed back on another college president who kind of effectively the argument was, well, we really can't criticize universities right now because the Trump administration and what's going on. And her response was kind of, no, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We probably should actually criticize and turn a critical eye on what universities have been doing for a while, because it's maybe part of the reason why we're in this mess. But I think that's another institution I would point to. I can also point to, I think Vanderbilt has had strong leadership for a while as well. And the top ranked school in our rankings is Claremont McKenna. Their president's retiring this year, but he's been a strong leader on this issue for a while too. And I'll note that, like, I couldn't tell you exactly why, but it's a place to look. They score in the top 50 on almost all of the components, and then the top 10 on the majority of them.
Purdue's an interesting one, not so
Yeah.
much from a cultural leadership. They're solid. Something Purdue has done for a long time, and they had an incident like 2 weeks after we stopped actually tracking data. So depending on how they resolve that, they could drop pretty far in the rankings this upcoming year. But they've done a very good job with their freshman orientation. It contains role-playing exercises that make students actually engage with ideas they don't believe in. It used to, I don't know if it still does, put them in the shoes of someone actually experiencing a shout down, but it really like humanizes the use and the abuse, I suppose, of speech in a really good way that solidifies the idea right up front. And Purdue has long been pretty solid on those student components.
That's a great example. We're almost at time here. So, John, I want to end with you and ask, from a governance and alumni perspective, what role do you think Harvard Corporation, Harvard's Board of Overseers, and alumni play in making sure reforms actually take root in campus life and not just on paper? And Sean and Connor, feel free to chime in here as well.
Well, let's separate them. The corporation board and the board of overseers actually have real authority and real responsibilities. The corporation board in particular, they're supposed to set priorities. They're supposed to select the senior leadership, and they're supposed to provide oversight. So it's critical that body, set those priorities and set free speech and academic freedom and diversity of viewpoints to be critical missions of the university. I think also, I know we've talked some about President Garber. President Garber is only around for 2 more years, so we're going to be in a search process. Harvard's going to be in a search process, pretty soon. I think probably starting in the spring. It's critical that the next person, he or she, be committed to free speech and academic freedom, and they be empowered and supported by the corporation board. Alumni are one of the 3 pillars of any university. There's students, there's faculty, there's alumni. There's tens, probably hundreds of thousands of Harvard alumni across all the different schools. Stay engaged, and make sure that Harvard stays true to its mission, to veritas, to free speech, to academic freedom.
Connor, anything to add?
John just knocked it out of the park. The only thing I'd add is during that search process for a new president, don't just hope you get a president who cares about these free speech principles, everything John just outlined. Push during. You're right. The board can't be a rubber stamp. They need to look hard. They need to prioritize these as much. They need to put the energy behind whatever executive they bring in. And that's the role alumni can play, right? Whether it's listening sessions, whether it's open comment periods, wherever, town halls, alumni should be asking those tough questions. How would an incoming president handle, example A, B, or C? Because it's going to be a tough time, when this new president comes in, and Harvard's going to have to be the national leader it is. For better or worse, where Harvard goes, the rest of higher ed follows.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Sean, Connor, and John, for your time. To the attendees, thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll send a follow-up email with more information. Don't forget to subscribe to 1636 Forum, Harvard Alumni for Free Speech and Fire, which we will also send links to if you haven't
thank you,
already.
Allison. Thank you, Allison, for doing a great job keeping us in our lanes.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.